أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all for joining me. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to be able to introduce my friend Barbara Smith. We will have a slightly different format for today because after I read her bio, I'm actually going to do my little intervention. I like to try to say something about my friends along the way as friends. And then by request, Barbara and I will just have a running conversation rather than have her give a personal bio just by monologue. And it should be fun, okay? Barbara Smith is an author, activist, and independent scholar who has played a groundbreaking role in opening up a national, cultural, and political dialogue about the intersections of race, class, sexuality, and gender. She was among the first to define an African-American women's literary tradition and to build Black women's studies and Black feminism in the United States. She's been politically active in many movements for social justice since the 1960s. I'm going to read the titles of three of her major collections, and I want you all to reflect, where were you when this came about? Conditions, 5, the Black Women's Issue with Lorraine Bethel in 1979. All the women are white, all the men are Black, but some of us are brave. Black Women's Studies with Gloria T. Hall and Patricia Bell Scott, 1982. And Homegirls, a Black Feminist Anthology, 1983. She's also co-author with Ellie Bolkin and Minnie Bruce Pratt of Yours in Struggle, 3 Feminist Perspectives on Anti-Semitism and Racism, 1984. She is the general editor of the Reader's Companion to U.S. Women's History with Wilma Mankiller, Gwendolyn Mink, Marisa Navarro, and Gloria Steinem, 1998. A collection of her essays, The Truth That Never Hurts, Writing on Race, Gender, and Freedom, was published by Rutgers Press in 1998. Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around. 40 years of movement building with Barbara Smith, edited by Althea Jones and Virginia Eubanks with Barbara Smith, was published by SUNY Press in 2014. She was a co-founder of the Combahee River Collective in 1975 and of Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press in 1981. The first US publisher for women of color, which reached a wide national audience, where she continued as publisher until 1995. She resides in Albany, New York, and served 2 terms as a member of the Albany Common Council, and also served as the Special Community Projects Coordinator for the City of Albany, helping to implement the equity agenda. In 2005, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. I did not choose to read all of her other awards, but as you can see, they spanned over a long period of time. In the new format for this particular Friends Along the Way, I want to share with you just a little bit of my story. I moved into the city of Washington, D.C. when I was 10 years and 11 months old. And I did so after having spent the summer homeless because we were evicted from my childhood home. At that time, my mother would disappear and I wouldn't see her again until my father got his act together and, bought us another house about a year later. And so I consider this sort of like the fall of innocence from childhood. And it just was an indication of just how intense can be the experience of poverty in the day-to-day life. Just to put that in context, it was 1963. And, within a few weeks of moving into DC, my father took us to the March on Washington with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, where he gave the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. So when I lived in Maryland, I really put most of my attention into nature and the forest behind our houses, and I was able to move about freely. But when I went into the city, I didn't like it at all. It was just so overwhelming for me. So I became a real introvert. And coincidentally, I also discovered the public library, so I could get books and just sort of dive into those spaces. The thing about having reading as a solace also has a context, and that is that nobody in my family were readers. My father read the Bible, kept up with the local news, but nobody did this at all, and neither did any of my friends. It was just like something that I did all by myself. And when I entered middle school, it turned out that my family's location with regard to matters of reading and therefore to education had an impact on me, in that I had no idea that there was any merit in that at all. I just kind of loved to read, and eventually was discovered by a guidance counselor because of my national test scores, and she approached me with the perception of a different relationship to learning and education. And she was the one who got me into a program that led me to Mount Holyoke College in 1967. And I was there with about 70 other teenage girls, and all of us were negotiating between the poverty of our backgrounds and the potential of our intellect. And that's where I met Barbara Smith. And I needed to give that background because I wanted to show what a difference it made for me to meet a real person, a Black female, who also read and who valued literature. And before that time, I thought it was just something that happened to me and that I would always be alone in it. I never knew that Black people could value education. I never knew that a young woman could challenge and be challenged by things like literature, epistemology, philosophy, hermeneutics, and ethics. But not only was it in terms of the reading, but also in terms of the writing. Barbara taught me how to do journaling, and I literally did journaling for the next 30 years until you have PCs at home and the internet, and then I started to blog and write emails. So when I would read these stories, most of the actors in the stories were either white or non-human, because I also love science fiction. And so it was so moving for me to meet a Black and female person like myself who had already lived a journey of affirmation to the world of abstract reasoning, information, stories, story ideas, language, linguistics, and the like. And so it was one of the most pivotal moments of my life, because then I could begin to believe in something that I had never seen before. So that summer, Barbara opened me up to the experience of life as accessible to even me, a young Black female. Before I knew her, I thought it was fantasy, and I didn't even have the notion that I could dream beyond something, because I never saw any actual possibilities. We were close during the time that I was in high school. I literally integrated an all-white high school with one of the other girls who had been in this summer program with me. Because it was in the state of Massachusetts, we spent more time together. And so a lot of how I thought about possibilities in my life was shaped by Barbara and by my experience of meeting her. And things never got much better for my family. When my father died, it was before I finished my first degree from an Ivy League university. And when my mother died at the same age where I am today, all she could say was, all I know is you got all them degrees. None of my siblings went to the university, and in the next generation, none of their children went to the university. It's only in the next generation, that is the sons and daughters of my nieces and nephews, where a small percentage of them are starting to go to the university. So sometimes while we are living our embodied and transformative experiences, we don't even know how important it will be, who we meet and how it does so much for the life path that we take. And I think that's what happened. And when I was contacted by the biographer for Barbara Smith, I went and did this, deep reflection about how important she'd been in my life. Not only in terms of, that summer and then the subsequent years when we were both in the same state, but eventually, as I moved into the role that I am trying to fulfill as a Muslim woman and the development of Islamic feminism, I would rely very heavily upon the work that she had written and published in order to articulate how the main Western ideas of feminism was mostly white, middle class, heteronormative, and secular. And so her work supported me in order to say that that wasn't the kind of feminism that I was looking for. And so even though we were not in touch, her work was still touching my life. And I also saw that she didn't have to do anything to support what was for me a sacred opening. She just had to be who she is. And as we look back over 55 years since the moment that we met, we see that she has maintained a life trajectory of offering even greater service to humankind as her life unfolds. So that brings me to her life contributions and how it is that we will begin our conversation here because of her ability to create and sustain a trajectory of providing creative, critical, comprehensive thoughts and ideas around matters of justice and dignity from an intersectional perspective. I am going to ask some questions here. Before I do this, I have to share with you that my tech assistant sent me a message after I created an ad to promote this event. And she said, I'm still struggling with this ad because Facebook had robots reviewing the ad, not humans. And since the pandemic, they started to tighten security around social issues, elections, and politics. And the robot considered our ad to be in violation. So it was rejected 5 times. And that made me think, hashtag Black Girls Magic and Black Feminists. These turned out to be what were considered to be a security risk. So we are still not there. So to start the conversation, I just want to ask Barbara to, I have 2 questions and then, actually we will take it from there. But the first one is like really personal. Can you just share with us a little bit about your own life journey, and then I want to talk a lot more about your work academically and intellectually.
Well, thank you so much, Amina. This is such a pleasure and such a rare experience. Before we started, I told you that I was not nervous, and you said that you were. And I said, well, I'm always nervous before I do something like this, but I'm not now because it's just like a conversation between very, 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 very long time friends. And you named it, you said 55 years. It's actually 54. I was doing the math. Next year it'll be 55, but that's okay. Who's counting? Who's counting? I want to just give a little context before I talk about my growing up years. And you spoke so beautifully about yours and said some things that I didn't even necessarily know or either needed to be reminded of. But the name of the program that where we met was called A Better Chance. And it was a program that prepared very, very talented students of color, predominantly Black, but also some Latinx, Latino students, and some a few white students too, who all had in common that they were incredibly gifted and also living in very, very difficult circumstances, usually as a result of economic oppression. So that's what A Better Chance was for. And Mount Holyoke had a summer program, Williams College had a summer program, Dartmouth College had a summer program, and Carleton College out in Minnesota had one. And the purpose was to prepare students during that summer to go to the most exclusive private prep schools in the United States, which, as we know, probably still to this day, are concentrated in New England. So that's what the purpose of the summer program was. Because they had lost funding or had less funding that summer of 1967, the decision was made that they were only going to send the male students and that the young women who participated would go right back to the environments that they had lived in previously. That was not acceptable to me. I was a resident tutor, so we are different in age. I thought, I was wondering if someone thought that when we met, I was a part of the program and I'm the same age as Amina. No, I'm not. I was born in 1946. That means I'm 6 years older. And somehow that equipped me to be a resident tutor. I was, of course, a student at Mount Holyoke, and that equipped me to be a resident tutor during that summer. And that's how we met. Amina was a part of my resident tutor group, my tutor group, as it was called. And it was a magical, magical, magical experience, not just because of the academic work that was offered, but also because of the cultural things that we did. Just so rich, just like enrichment on steroids. So it was, as I said, it was magical. And then there was a reality. That was a summer, if you remember, that both Newark and Detroit went up in flames. So to be in this bucolic, setting, and again, I'm not going to attest to like how rural it was at the time, even more so then than it is now. And it's not a metropolis now in South Hadley where Mount Holyoke is. But in those days, it was just like downright country. And like, so here we are, on this campus, doing, our thing, and then going to the drugstore and the little tiny strip of stores on the main street in town and pulling out and getting a Time magazine or Newsweek magazine with the cover photo of a city like the one I grew up in, which is Cleveland, Ohio, but a city like the one that I grew up in flames. People call them riots. I never do. They are urban insurrections. So this was a time of urban insurrections. People saying, my people, our people as Black women, saying, nope, not going to deal with this madness anymore. Often the catalyst was police brutality. If you look at the history of urban insurrections in the United States, often the catalyst is just like what happened with George Floyd last year. Egregious police violence against humans. So to go back now, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. I was born in November of 1946. 7 minutes after I arrived, my twin sister Beverly arrived, and we were the only children that our mother had. Our family had come from rural Georgia, from the deep South, a little town called Dublin, that's between Macon and Savannah. And as I speak about my childhood and my family, which I just love to do, we can do the whole hour on that, but I'll try to restrain myself. But when I talk about just trying to understand what was it like, what were the influences? One of the things I've started saying recently is that my sister and I were the only Northerners in our house. We were the only two people from the North, born in the North, in our house. Everybody else was from the Deep South. And so that meant that we had, and I've written this, this is a direct quote from me, that we had an essentially Southern upbringing in a Northern setting. Now, that's not unusual for people in my generation. It's not unusual for people who are younger than I, because that's where our roots, by and large, are heavily concentrated. So that experience of the Great Migration and being the first kids in the family to be born into a family that has gone through the Great Migration, that was a very typical experience. My family began to migrate from Georgia after World War I, not after World War II. So they were more settled as the century went on. Unlike what Amina described, our family was all about education. They were just on it. And as my sister says, and I love this phrase that she uses because we are twins, he says, the twin pillars in our family were religion and education. The twin pillars, and so we were all about the church, Black Baptists, what a surprise. And when I say we, I'm talking about the people in my family, not me. But the thing is that we were raised in the church, and then we were absolutely aimed at education and acquiring it. Our maternal aunt, and I only know the maternal side of my family. My sister and I have never met our father. We've never seen as much as a photograph of him. To this day, we have no idea. We've done some family research. We know some background about him, but as far as like picking him out of a lineup, we have never seen a photograph. That's all I want, is to see a photograph of what our father looked like. But be that as it may, when I speak of my family, I'm talking about the maternal side. My maternal aunt worked at the main library in Cleveland, Ohio. So it's a completely different experience. So we knew that books existed. She brought books home in shopping bags that had no due dates because she worked at the library. My mother, who tragically, the tragedy of my life, our mother, we were only with her for 9 years. She died when we were 9 years old. And she actually was a graduate of a historically Black college, Fort Valley State College, now a university in Georgia. And she had a bachelor's of science in education. And the two jobs that she had when we were tiny and when we were with her growing up, she worked as a nurse's aide and as a supermarket cashier. And that was very typical of what Black people with advanced degrees got to do during total Jim Crow segregation. I was born during the last years of Jim Crow. I was totally influenced by the freedom struggle of our people, which manifested, of course, as a civil rights movement, and then, of course, transformed and grew into Black liberation, Black nationalism, and Black power. But civil rights was the first, chapter of that. I became active in the civil rights movement as a teenager in Cleveland, Ohio, and I've been politically active ever since then. So that's me, a little nutshell, and let's see what Amina wants to know now.
Okay, so I want to paraphrase some comments that I lifted off the Wikipedia page, particularly to have a conversation about intersectionality. Because Barbara was one of the first scholars to coin, was the first scholar to coin the term identity politics, which he used to describe the intersection of identity that creates unique forms of oppression for women of color, especially Black lesbian women. And from that conception of identity politics, Kimberly Crenshaw developed the idea of intersectionality, which all of us know about now. She was critical of second wave feminism for often neglecting and sometimes intentionally excluding Black women's experiences. If feminism did not include all women, she claimed, it was not feminism so much as female self-aggrandizement. And I remember Linda Sarsour, who is a Palestinian-American activist, said that, if your feminism, doesn't include me in my own location with regard to being, a hybrid, American and being a Muslim, then your feminism is not for me. And in the context of this work, it's important to understand that there was no political movement for Black feminism until the works of people like Barbara Smith. And as a lesbian who has worked on intersectional approaches to feminism, this need for a clear consideration of matters of sexuality as well as gender and race is really important in the work that I'm doing now, even though she was doing it in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And even with regard to working with the LGBTQ movement, she became disillusioned by the movement's lack of complexity. And this is what queer Muslims experience all the time, that they have to sometimes choose between Islamophobia and homophobia. So I actually want to have a little bit more conversation about how you saw the imperative of intersectionality, and particularly because when you saw it, yours was not, what I would call reactive. Instead, it was proactive and creative. The whole idea of the kitchen table press, the whole idea of being able to pull something like that together at the time in which you did it. Can you talk a little bit about the motivation, the challenges, and ultimately, how you saw the benefits of it in the long run?
Really very rich questions that have many layers. I will try to respond as much as I possibly can to the great questions and issues that you raised. One thing I want to just say very, very clearly, though, I did not come up with the concept of identity politics. The co-authors of the Combahee River Collective Statement came up with it. I don't know which one of us said it, but those co-authors, there are only three of us, are Demita Frazier, Beverly Smith, my sister, and me. So that was a collective effort. And one of the things that I point out about the Combahee River Collective Statement, up until recently, it had no authors attributed. Like many movement documents that were written at that time and before that time, there's no specific author who is cited. It was a statement from and by the Combahee River Collective. Authorship now is known primarily because of Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's book, How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective, because she interviewed the three of us. But as I said, it was a collective process, writing that statement for a book edited by Zila Eisenstein, a longtime friend who just sent me some text today about going to participate in the marches that happen all over this country around women's reproductive freedom and rights. So as I said, we've been friends for those half-century marks that we're talking about this evening. But Zila edited a book called Capitalist Patriarchy and the Case for Socialist Feminism. And that's why we wrote the Combahee River Collective Statement. Had she not asked, I don't know if we ever would have written it, because we were writing it for a publication and a book, and we got our stuff together, and it turned out to be the Combahee River Collective Statement. Now, around interlocking oppressions, there were, depending on how you define Black feminism, Black women studies scholars and historians and thinkers track Black feminism back to the 19th century, because there were women then speaking out about, to use the term, the intersection of race and gender in the lives of Black women. I'm thinking of Anna Julia Cooper in particular. I would say that Ida B. Wells Barnett. They're definitely people. Frances E.W. Harper, who was a poet and novelist. These were people who were writing about gender and gender and race simultaneously, and sometimes doing organizing around that. Now, then, fast forwarding into the middle of the 20th century, the Third World Women's Alliance, which grew out of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They also were on that page, as was Toni Cade Bambara, who edited the anthology The Black Woman, published in 1970, which is considered now to be the first actual, if not a Black feminist anthology, because it doesn't say Black feminism or feminism, but it does have content that deals with the intersections of race, class, don't forget class and gender. What Combahee brought to the dialogue, I think, does really focus on sexuality and the fact not all of us were lesbians, but we were always a very small group, but a good number of us were experiencing being out Black lesbians in the unforgiving years of the 1970s. Keep in mind, Stonewall, the Stonewall Rebellion, which is used as a marker for the beginning of the modern gay rights, as it was called at the time, are lesbian and gay movement, or lesbian and gay rights movement, or as we now say, queer movement, and we also say LGBTQIA. These were not terms that were used at the time, but as I said, that marker of Stonewall that happened in 1969 is kind of where the clock starts, and anything that was happening then in the 1970s was less than a decade after Stonewall. So Combahee, we were organizing in Boston starting in 74, and it was 5 years after Stonewall. How do you think people looked at us as people who were not heterosexual? They were not really that happy about that. We paid our dues. We paid our dues big time, particularly in being ostracized from our Black community. Those are the biggest dues I feel like I paid, that we were considered to be persona non grata and just outcast to the race, that we lost our racial credibility by being involved in relationships and also in politics that prioritize relationships between people of the same gender. Black gay men were experiencing parallel kinds of ostracism and marginalization. So we had to take care of each other and build. So I think that what characterizes in the work of Combahee in particular, and of the Combahee and the work that the Combahee River Collective Statement has done, because that's why people generally know about Combahee from having read the statement, is what characterized it and made it unique is that we did talk about the oppression of homophobia. We weren't talking about transphobia because those political understandings had not been clearly articulated at that point. But what we did definitely is in line with what we now have in our incredible transgender community and political movement. Our perspective on being so all-inclusive, just as Amina mentioned, talking about Linda Sarsour saying something very similar about how if there's no room for a person like me, then it's not really feminism. And that was really our perspective. We were never separatists, never, we were not about separatism. We were not lesbian separatists, and we were not Black separatists. We had, some of us had been in the Panthers. We had been involved in the civil rights struggle. We had, in my case and in the cases of others, had done everything we possibly could to end the war in Vietnam that we were successful in doing. We had an international, global perspective. We described ourselves as third world women, just as other people who were progressive and on the left did at that time. We did not use the term people of color or women of color widely. We talked about being third world women or third world people. And that meant that we were connecting to places all around the world, including the global South, where people of color were fighting and often bloody confrontations to throw off the shackles of colonialism and imperialism, We subscribed at times, and this is not something we came up with ourselves, but the concept of internalized colonies, that people of color living in the United States and other places in the diaspora are actually internally colonized. So as I said, we had that international perspective. We would work with anybody who had similar visions for justice. So when we're characterized, what has happened with identity politics is that people now think of it as narrow, and the worst attacks, to me, some of the worst attacks against identity politics come from the left, because they don't know what in the world it is. They have no idea. Even if they read the statement, they put it down because they don't understand the words that are on the page. The reason that we coined the phrase identity politics is that we were asserting that Black women had a right to shape and determine our own political agendas, period, full stop. That was it. And we were not saying, and if you're not a Black woman, you're not worth anything. And if you're not a Black woman, you don't have any problems. We're the only ones with problems. Or if you're not a Black woman, we don't care, what's going on in, let's say, in China or in Vietnam or, wherever, warfare is happening, in Mexico, in Chiapas, wherever, we were not saying that, and like white lesbian separatists, they didn't necessarily like where we were coming from, because their perspective was that men were the root of all evil, and that, we could just get rid of men, then everything would be fine. And we're just like, are you kidding us? There's still going to be white supremacy, there's still going to be capitalism and class oppression. So no, we were not down with white lesbian separatism. We were not down with a kind of very unrefined nationalism that was narrow. There's a place for nationalism in our political thinking, because what's going on with the nation state, with land, with hegemony, all of that. These are really good questions. But does it have to be narrow and homophobic and transphobic and misogynist in the process? No, it doesn't. So those are the kinds of things we were grappling with. You've gotten me going, Amina.
That's good. That's good. I resonate with this because in terms of just the use of the word feminism in the context of Islam and Muslims, we still have people that say that there is no such thing. And not only is there such a thing, one of our members of the gallery is amongst those early critical thinkers. She's a historian. Sorry, I'm going to out you, Margot, who came up with an understanding that there's actually been 3 waves of Muslim feminist activism and scholarship. And at the 3rd wave, we actually came up with the necessity for constructing our own meaning, not only of the term feminism, but also of the term Islam. And that's the distinction between Islamic feminism and, say, Muslim feminists, because any Muslim can be a feminist, but they could determine that they want to be a socialist feminist, or they want to be like a liberal feminist, or a spectrum. But Islamic feminists are really wedded to the idea of the production of new knowledge. So again, it's this constructive part of it. And for me, that constructive part of it also has to be self-interrogating. So the places where, for example, when we work on gender without sexuality, we make certain presumptions that kind of like make a monolith, which isn't really true. But also because dealing with sexuality is not just dealing with non-heterosexuality. Everybody has a sexuality. And so the idea that somehow you can escape that discussion because you're dealing with gender, and Islam, to me, just creates sort of like the next level of where we have to go in order to be able to challenge ourselves to be as inclusive as the language that we have promoted with regard to the issues that are, in fact, the ones that we have worked on prior to being challenged. So I think you have a project that you've done with Islamophobia. And I just want to say something about Islamophobia because I don't work on Islamophobia. I don't need to, because I'm Muslim and I'm Muslim centric. However, I literally have never known any non-Muslims working on Islamophobia who are also Black and feminists and queer. So can you tell me a little bit about your, your work on Islamophobia and how that came about?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I'm so glad that you asked it. I think it goes back to, let's see now, I don't want to misspeak. Probably in the most organized form, and I live in Albany, New York, Mohican, Mohawk, Haudenosaunee land. Original, the people who were here when the settler colonialists arrived. But I think in Albany, it was like after 9/11, we also were, spoke out against the first Gulf War. And that was in, 1991. But the thing is that after 9/11, an organizations to protest what happened, which we could anticipate that, this country was going to run roughshod, over, countries that had nothing to do with 9/11, just because they could and because there were resources that this country thought belonged to them or that they needed to have. So, you go into Iraq and nobody from Iraq had anything to do, as I understand it, with what happened on 9/11. It's just, nuts. Just like and like what has happened in Afghanistan, much more, recently in the last few weeks. I mean, our so-called foreign policy. I mean, I don't really use expletives in public. The thing is that you can kind of guess what I'm thinking about it and how it rolls. But in any event, an organization started in Albany called the Stand for Peace Coalition, and we had protests. Albany is quite small, less than 100,000 people, although it is the capital of New York State. And and by we, I mean anti-racist feminists. There's such a thing as anti-racist feminists. They don't get any play or any kind of publicity because nobody wants anybody to know that there's such a thing. We hear a lot about white feminism. But when was the last time you heard about anti-racist feminism? You don't hear it because it doesn't serve the narrative, the master narrative of keeping things as they are. But like a group of us, who would work together as anti-racist feminists, which included women who are not people of color, we were a part of that Stand for Peace group, and we told them that they needed to have make specific efforts to have the leadership of people of color. And we then started something within the organization called the Stand for Peace Anti-Racism Committee. We outlasted the original organization, and we were a thorn in the side of some of the white male, typical, kind of lefties who really don't have a clue and didn't have a clue, and maybe don't have one now. But what we decided then in our Stand for Peace Anti-Racism Committee was to begin to make connections with the Muslim community very, very explicitly. And we thought that the best way to do that was to connect with Muslim women, which is exactly what we did. And it was a really wonderful period as far as us becoming, and I'll say myself, it was a wonderful period for me to become more informed and more enlightened about what was happening with the Muslim community in my own neck of the woods, up here in upstate, the capital region of New York. We would, there are some women who met with us on a regular basis who are actually a part of the Stand for Peace Anti-Racism Committee. And so we would do things like have a program at the library to talk about issues of Muslim women. And our role was to be supportive and to do the kind of legwork so that such dialogues could happen. We did other kinds of programming. We visited mosques at the invitation of people in the Muslim community, which of course was very generous. And so we go to, we didn't do it on a regular basis, but on a couple of occasions we had the opportunity to visit mosques in the area. And then sometimes we also would have these delightful meals at restaurants that were owned by people in the Muslim community. So we would do that, and like when we did that, we would meet more people than who came to our meetings, So we were doing all of that, standing fast, speaking out against racism. So that was kind of like the first kind of chapter, as I said, right after 9/11. Then when let's see, how did this go? I think it was like when the incompetent, devilish former inhabitant of the White House, when he was on the verge of being elected, and of course it promised, to do Muslim bans and all of the just despicable things that he did and did to this country that we're still dealing with the consequences of. We knew it was coming, but we actually started the Capital District Coalition Against Islamophobia prior to his election. I think we started it the year before. And the reason that we started it is because of that mass shooting that happened. I think was it San Bernardino, California? I may have I always get the Sands and in California. There's so many of them. But I don't know if you recall that there was a mass shooting in California that Muslim individuals participated in. And that's when we thought, well, we need to be organized here because the onslaught the backlash is coming. So we actually then formed the Capital District Coalition Against Islamophobia prior to the incompetent, twice impeached individual coming into office, so that when he did, we actually had an organization up and running. And we did a number of things in that context. I stopped being active in the organization, and I believe it is still active, but there are other ways. We have a Jewish Voice for Peace chapter in Albany, and that, of course, stands and speaks out around the liberation of Palestine. And so there are other ways, that I've been engaged around these issues. We have a Palestinian, I always want to call it, I think it's the Palestinian Rights Committee. I always want to call it the Palestinian Solidarity Committee. But the thing is, I was going to those demonstrations for years before any of the other things that I've just mentioned, because, when you're part of the left and you're part of movements, you show up where you need to show up. And I'm as ignorant, as anyone about everything going on in our communities. Oh, and when I was on the Common Council, because of the work we were doing with the Muslim community, you remember after 9/11, you probably remember that there were these incredible government-sponsored sweeps to accuse and then prosecute people in the Muslim community and put them under the jail, just because they could. That was the hysteria. And of course, it's a way that this country generally deals with conflict and stuff. Instead of having like a rational support, it's like, let's lock some people up. That's why we have the prison industrial complex that we do. And there were two gentlemen from Albany who got swept up, in a scam, a sting operation. One of them, who I actually knew, because he had a pizza, he and his family ran a pizza shop. And so we got involved, in being supportive of them as well. But when I was on the council then, one of my wonderful friends, my closest friend on the Common Council, introduced legislation, which I think was the first in the nation, to express a sanction against these government sweeps against the Muslim community. So we had a very, very robust, day of speaking out about that. People came from all over the East Coast the day that we were going to vote on and then pass that legislation. So that's more than I thought, but yeah, I've been engaged.
Yeah, the recent US budget for its military industrial complex, $780 billion, is such a travesty on humanity.
Oh, yeah.
And it equals the budget of at least, I think, 7 or 8 other what we call leading first world
Mhm,
nations and
mhm.
that kind of thing. And so we're not out of the woods,
Not at all.
there's just a whole distortion in the way we do governance
Mhm.
and in the way we articulate, the ideas of democracy and freedom.
Right.
And these ideas are very problematic in the context of formerly colonized Muslim majority and even some Muslim minority contexts in which they are
Mhm.
still struggling
Mhm.
to address intersectional concerns with regard to their human dignity.
Right.
We are going to open up the gallery for
Good.
comments and questions.
Good.
If you look at your screen and it says participant, you can raise your hand if you want to be acknowledged with both your video and your audio. If you prefer just to use your audio, also raise your hand, just leave your camera off. And then lastly, if you prefer to have your questions be fielded or comments be fielded by me to Barbara, then you can just put them in the chat and I will monitor that as we go along. So please don't all speak at once. Not that it's possible. Yes, we have a nice cross section. Let people warm up a little bit.
Can I say something about homophobia? And I think, when we were talking before we began the actual broadcast, you were kind of asking, it seemed like, how is it that you came to this understanding, or how did you formulate your perspective about sexuality and gender expression in the context of the Black community? And I think, that our politics, and now when I say "our," I'm talking about Convehy, that the way that we came down on issues and the way that we tried to unpack issues came out of our habits and our experiences, and having an analysis, having a material analysis, and that I was getting ready to say a couple of minutes, more than a couple of minutes ago, that the thing that makes Combahee unique and our Black feminism is that we did it and acknowledge the reality of homophobia, a word that didn't even exist at the time. And then also that we were socialist and had a class analysis and a critique of capitalism. So those are the things I think that make the statement and our work unique, and why. And I think those are elements that make people interested in the work to this day. That's why it's relevant. People say, the Combahee River Collective Statement could have been written yesterday. And that's kind of like, everybody wants to hear that about their work, right? But it shows that we were on to something, that we had a way of understanding, or trying to understand, because we didn't understand everything by any means, but we had a way of trying to approach and understand political power and oppression that could be useful. So where are the hands now? Who's gonna say something?
I just wanted to ask you, sometimes people use this phrase ahead of your time. I want to know what your response to that is, because sometimes.
Well, you heard it. I laughed. I just giggled. I don't know if we were ahead of our time. I don't know. I really don't know.
I mean, in the 1970s, you're talking about something that literally took us until the 21st century to have a sort of, general public, or at least educated public, awareness with regard to it. And so it's like, it's just that whole thing about intersectionality only being popular, based on Kimberly Crenshaw's work. And yet, a good 20 plus years before that time, you're already working on it. And the Combahee River Collective Statement, actually, says that. And yet it just takes some time for these things to catch on. And I only say that because people say that about me as if that somehow should bring me some recourse, and it doesn't. because what it means is that you're waiting around for something to happen, which at the time in which you feel an imperative, you just sort of take it as self-evident. And yet, it's like, you're talking into the dark,
Right, indeed, indeed. And as I said, we paid many dues. Some of them very, with incredibly violent repercussions. But we were young, we were gifted and Black. Young, gifted, and Black. Did you see Summer of Soul? Oh, please, if you haven't seen it yet, watch it. But that's one of the moments when Nina Simone sings Young, Gifted, and Black as a tribute to Lorraine Hansberry's play. And of course, I remember when the song came out. It was just wonderful. But we were young, gifted, and Black, and we had all this energy, and we thought we could do anything. And as Demeter Fraser said at one of our meetings, this is not a mixed cake. We have got to make this up from scratch. We were courageous. I'm thinking about Audre Lorde, excuse me, who was affiliated with Combahee because we had 7 Black feminist retreats in the late 1970s, which were political, cultural, and all of that. We would have them over weekends up and down the East Coast. And Audre participated in almost all of them. But she described herself as a Black woman warrior, lesbian, cancer survivor, poet. And the word warrior is the one that's sticking out for me right at this moment, because we kind of function that way. It's kind of like, okay, so it doesn't exist. We think it needs to exist, so we're going to make it. And like that's a shorthand description of Kitchen Table Women of Color Press. Why in the world would we be so possessed as to think that we could do publishing of women of color, many of whom were lesbians, almost all of them who are radicals? Why did we think we could make a go of that? I mean, what were we thinking? Well, we did it anyway, and ahead of our time, with the time, I don't know, but just doing, I think that, I'm not religious. I think that I have some spiritual grounding. I feel like we were, and I'm talking about people in Combahee and Audrey and, Kitchen Table and just all the incredible things that were being done, not just by women of African heritage during that time either. But I feel like in some ways we were conduits, that, the needs and the concepts and the the deep desire for freedom was swirling. And then sometimes it landed. It was landed in an embodied person, I wrote an article about Combahee for a book that came out earlier this year titled 400 Souls, A Community History of African America. It's edited by Keisha Blaine and Ibram Kendi. And they asked me to write, everyone who wrote for the book, and there are 80 writers, was asked to write about a 5-year period. That's where you got the 400 years. So 80 writers writing about 5-year periods of history. I was asked to write about 74 through 79. And I tried to tell the story of Combahee as opposed to the analytical, kind of theoretical, whatever that is, never big on that anyway. But the thing is that, stories are much better than high theory, aren't they? Yeah. But in any event, I wanted to tell a story about Combahee. And the last paragraph, in the last paragraph, I say something pretty much like, I was saying, like, who would ever think that Combahee would come into existence in an improbable place, that being racist, white supremacist Boston, during a race war. Combahee was operating in Boston during a race war, the race war around court-ordered school desegregation. So who would ever think that we would be able to do our work in that kind of context? And I said it was like lightning struck. The fact that we found each other is like lightning struck, and we somehow by working collectively, because nobody knows anything by themselves, not as much. We know a few things, but the thing is that the real stuff that changes worlds happens is people working communally with each other. And so lightning struck, it brought us together, and we just did our work. And that's what Audrey would say too. She said, I'm a Black, lesbian, feminist, mother, warrior, cancer survivor, poet, doing her work. And then she'd say, are you doing yours? she was more than a notion. She'd say, I'm doing my work. Are you doing yours? You know, and I love that because it like puts it into perspective. I feel like anything that I've done, it's because I was just trying to do my work. And the work may be different, you know, certainly different than what I thought at Mount Holyoke in 1967. You know, who knew? Who knew? But the thing is, I was about work. I was about getting work done, right? So that's all it is. It's not about being special.
We have a comment or a question from Annie Sonnenfeld. Annie?
Hi, thank you for this forum. It was really wonderful, Ami, to hear about your background as well, because I did not know about the hardships. And Barbara, it's really nice to meet you and to learn about your work. And I have a lot of reading to do. I'm the founder and president of Muslims for Progressive Values, and I'm based here in Los Angeles. And I was speaking at the Women's March in Los Angeles today on abortion rights. And still it is a struggle to see minority women leaders on the stage. And I'm just wondering, from your rich history, any suggestions on how, because I always work in an intersectional way, and I also introduce myself always as a Muslim feminist. Is there, moving forward, how can we bring these, the minority voices to part of the planning process, not just the voice, not just being there on stage, but part of the planning process as well? Any suggestions as for myself working in the United States and in Los Angeles, how we can make that better?
Thank you so much, Annie. And it's nice to meet you as well. Sorry to be hoarse at this hour of the night. What you're asking about and wanting to accomplish, it has to be very intentional. You know, if you were, say, like the question that you laid out, say that it was a job assignment. Say that you work somewhere where that was a job. There would be meetings about it. There would be research done. There would be consultation with other organizations that had been successful at doing the very same thing. There might be some funding put toward it. That's not necessarily the bottom line in a movement context, although movements run on, need resources as well. But the only way that that you can change, like, the typical composition of who makes decisions in a political movement context is to focus on it. It's to say, okay, like maybe, I'm trying to think of something that a group might typically do. Like, well, maybe the protest that we were planning on having 2 weeks from now or next month, maybe we could, instead of putting our energy into that protest, or as well as putting our energy in, let's figure out how we can desegregate our political work and our political lives. Last summer, Zoom has been the bane of my existence because it's remote and doesn't require travel. I'm asked to do more things than I could possibly ever do if I had to go somewhere physically. But as a result, I've had some interesting experiences. And one of the things that I did last year was a series of, I think, 3 different sessions for our Extinction Rebellion group, which is the Environmental Climate Crisis Organization, International Organization, XR as it's called. So we have an XR in the Capital Region, Extinction Rebellion. And it was clear, and they were very interested in learning how to do organizing that was not segregated. And we did 3 sessions to talk about, like, how did it get this way? What's the history of all of this? What are the meaning of some of the terms? And then what can we do to change things? One of the things that I feel, and this may sound simple-minded or simplistic, is that one of the ways that things stay segregated in a political movement context is because people's lives are segregated. And I noticed this, like, when I first moved to Albany from the metropolis of New York City, Brooklyn, to be specific, which of course was so multiracial and multi-ethnic and diverse. But when I moved up here, I would go to like a poetry reading or something like that, and everybody there would be white. And I started looking around, and this is a whiter area than New York City or Buffalo and some of the other cities. But the thing is, I would look around and I said, these people don't have any people of color in their lives. They don't have any, because if they did, they might have invited them to come to whatever it was, the film, the poetry reading, the protest, whatever it was. When you have friends and there's something you're doing that you think is either important or fun, you let them know. So, when you go to a place where there's nothing but white people in the audience, you can say, yeah, I guess they're not really very tight with any people of color because they didn't invite anyone to come with them. And that's not simplistic. We have to desegregate our lives. But as I said, put time into it. Talk about it strategically and do it with no guilt. Guilt's not going to get us anywhere on this. It's like just being practical. We have a practical problem. Let's figure out practical solutions.
Thank you.
I like the idea of the three steps, meet, research, and consult. I think I'll keep those in mind first. The effort that I'm working on now, which, as I said, is the integration of the study of sexualities in Islamic studies, not just in the context of the US, but I'm currently in a Muslim majority context. And there's work that goes on, and it's really scattered, but there's also an intellectual tradition of a inclusive kind of discourse around sexuality from the Islamic intellectual legacy. And yet, when we bring this matter up today, once again, there's this accusation that somehow we're trying to, follow the West, as if there were not queer people all the time everywhere.
I see that's the bottom line.
Yeah.
Yeah, throughout human history.
May I say something to that, please? Sorry to interrupt, but so I do a lot of advocacy on LGBT rights, and even at the United Nations, and Muslims themselves use that narrative against the work that we do. Muslims themselves in the Muslim majority countries, or you're just parroting, or you're just a Western tool. But the challenge, you don't have anti-LGBT, anti-homosexual legislation prior to colonization. And at that point, that's when they step back and they have to sort of reflect themselves. But it's unfortunate how in the human rights work and in the field, in the small towns and villages, the propagation by governments and by Muslim religious leaders is that human rights is a Western construct. And it's such an uphill battle to take that narrative and say, no, we own it. We own it long before the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, people. So I just had to say that. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, and thank you. Any other people who want to jump in?
Annie was saying that the raise hand function is not working. So if you want to wave your actual hand, somehow when I'm on my iPad, if I move my hands too much, which is my norm, there's a little thing that goes, you want to raise your virtual hand, which is really strange. It doesn't happen on my PC, but yeah, technology. Yes, anything that you want to add? Deanna was saying, thank you, Annie, for articulating that so beautifully. We do have the issue in the context of any place where there is an overlap in our discourses of being considered somehow we're just mimicking the colonizers. And one of the things that I've done in the context of working on Islam and feminism is to articulate the theological basis for gender equality and reciprocity based on the fundamental principle of, Islamic monotheism. So sometimes to bring the argument back to the table, given the realities of the political mess that is, the world, sometimes we have to re-articulate using the master's tools so that the master can understand. Not because it's the end all, but because sometimes that's the only language that they understand. When you say that, being engaged, with the challenge and the struggles, the title of my second book is Inside the Gender Jihad. And the word jihad, which is also one of those phrases that gets used only in a derogatory sense, in its origin actually means struggle. So I'm inside the gender struggle, and why would I let, for example, mainstream, white supremacists tell me how to use the language, of my religious tradition? Why do I not have agency over things? That's the same thing we did with Islamic feminism. It's like we define Islam and we define feminism, and in both cases we define it in such a way that it is inclusive of our realities. That is also, I should say, part of the legacy that you bequeath me, because you gave me an appreciation of what you can do with language, and it becomes a tool for your liberation. So I'm also indebted to you for that.
Thank you.
And you have a comment or question, please?
Yeah, it's a combination. First of all, I want to reintroduce myself to Barbara. About 50 years ago, I think it was, probably, or 40, somewhere between 40 and 50 years ago, I was in Boston. I was at that time working at Wheelock College, and I actually came and spoke at one of your classes, I think. Were you in Boston? Were you teaching in Boston at that time, Barb?
I was teaching in Boston in the 1970s. I taught at Emerson.
Emerson, yeah.
Yes, and also at UMass Boston.
Okay, because I came to Emerson. I was teaching a course actually in Black women's history and literature, although anyway, when I saw that this was happening, I knew that I had to be here because I just had needed the energy of this conversation of the two of you, because it's occurring to me as a person who came of age at that same time. I was taken as a child of 12 to the March in Washington by my mother. No, I was 11, actually. I was not yet 12. And the time that we came of age, those years, I remember thinking that the whole world was about to change because of what we were doing, what was happening in those days, closing down universities, taking over buildings, stopping business as usual because of global events, getting a picture of a global consciousness when we were young and thought we could do anything. And when I saw the photograph of you and the publicity for this, and I thought, look at this, it's just so important in these days when we know that our collective job, and the way I look at it from a spiritual level, is that we've been given this assignment to be alive in these days at a very critical moment. And those of us who came of age at that time, at least for me, I know that I get energy today from the picture I got as 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old. And we did things that nobody taught us how to do, but we were inspired. And a lot of people, I hear a lot of hopelessness in these days, and I'm not hopeless. And in part, it's because of people like both of you. But I remember you from those days, Barbara Smith, and I just want to say I'm a witness. That's my comment. My question has to do with a kind of intersectionality that I hear in your working history. You didn't talk about them together, but you have worked on anti-Semitism and you've worked on Islamophobia. And I want to hear you reflect on whether or not that has been a challenge, standing as ally, as a Gentile, and as not a Muslim, standing as allies to Jews and Muslims. What's that been like for you? That particular intersection.
Those are really interesting questions. And like when you said you came to my class at Emerson, I was trying to get into my Wayback Machine, and I remember inviting people to speak in the class. Where did you teach somewhere at that time?
I was an admissions officer at Wheelock, and then they realized that I taught a course at Wheelock in Black women's history and literature while I was an admissions officer. Well, that's another story, but I'm not sure. And I also was working at the Black History Museum, African American History Museum, during those years. So,
well, I'm so sorry but I do remember having guests, and I'm just trying to remember, who it was.
It's fine. Yeah. It's fine. But yes, I
really appreciate your remembering that interaction and bringing back fond memories of a time when I was so excited about what we were building. And I say we, you and I, and we were building Black women's studies at that time. So I appreciate that. Now, as far as how it is to both oppose Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, I was getting ready to say that it's been harder to oppose anti-Semitism because there's much more pushback in the Black community about that stance. Whereas, I guess, maybe the largest proportion of people who are Muslim in the United States are also of African heritage. Am I correct about that? That, a large proportion of Muslims.
We're the single largest ethnic group. It's just that because we also have hybrid and intersectional identities, that sometimes it gets collapsed. But if you look at, if you look at otherwise, the African American section is the largest.
So there's more connection then. Black people are more familiar, whether Muslim or not. They're more familiar with the existence of people who are Muslim and Black, and also, some of that is because of the Nation of Islam. But
Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, they all want to claim it, so it's like, okay, we'll be kind of friends.
Exactly. Whereas with seeing oppression, the oppression of anti-Semitism targeting people who are Jewish, I think that's a bigger stretch. The hardest thing I ever wrote was that essay for the book Yours in Struggle, 3 Feminist Perspectives on Anti-Semitism and Racism. And I also feel in many ways it's a piece of writing that has been published with which I am most dissatisfied to this day. It was so hard to figure out how to kind of tread, the kind of landmines around identity and actual conflict between the Jewish community and the Black community. At the same time, there's an incredible history of solidarity amongst those communities. So it's always a balancing act. As an out lesbian, I don't think I need to say much more about that. But just always, like when you have a lot of identities that are not embraced by mainstream institutions and entities, you're always calibrating in your head, how's this landing? What do they think? Am I being too this? Am I being too that? I used to go, I taught at the University of Minnesota in the fall of 1986. And it was just a special one quarter appointment with women's studies and Black studies, even though I wasn't appointed by them. They saved my life when I was out there. But be that as it may, it made some wonderful contacts and connections. But one of the things that was also exciting about being in Minneapolis is that it has, and I think this is probably still true, the largest indigenous community, urban indigenous community in the United States. So I got to meet indigenous women in a way that I never had been able to do anywhere else. And so, we would do some things together. Sometimes we'd have like obviously I like to eat, but we would have like a nice meeting with dinner or whatever, and just getting to know people. After that, I met some people who are also a part of the LGBTQ community in Minneapolis and also elsewhere. And in Minneapolis, the Twin Cities, they had these wonderful, I don't remember what they call them. I think they call them gatherings of indigenous people. And I was actually invited to come to, I think, 2 of them. And one of the things that we laughed about so much is that they were very quiet, and like the loud people were the Black people. It was so funny. I said, like when Black people get together, you can't hear anything. You can't hear anything because we're just talking. We're loud. We love it. We're very performative and dramatic, And then, like going to these indigenous gatherings, people were really chill. They were like, we don't need to shout. Why are you shouting? So anyway, so it's like, folk ways, and, just like, who am I in the world, and also being able to examine yourself and look at yourself and try to figure out like, okay, so, well, Bernice Johnson Reagan says it best in her essay, originally a speech, Coalition Politics Turning the Century. It's the last piece in my book, Homegirls, and it's the last piece in the book on purpose, because I wanted people to leave that book with the idea, like, if we're not in this together, we will never get anywhere. So Coalition Politics Turning the Century. And she talks about how a coalition is not your home place, and you have to stretch to be in a coalition. And you may not get fed in a coalition. Don't be going to a coalition thinking you're going to get a bottle with some milk in it. If you want that, you need to go home and get that there, because that's not how coalitions function. But what she's really talking about is like, what kind of capacities of character and of just, decency and insight and graciousness do we need to have in order to stretch across identities? Another concept for that is this bridge called my back. Kate Rushin, who wrote the bridge poem, which is at the beginning of the book, she wrote that poem before she ever knew there was such a book. She wrote the bridge poem that opens this bridge called My Back without ever knowing that there was going to be a book. And in that poem, she talks about being able to feel and touch, I think, both sides of things, and being like this conduit, this bridge between, my cousin and, and the person, down the block and at the office. We're bridge people. And then Gloria Anzaldúa writes about the borderlands. Mm-hmm. And all of these people, are writing about the same thing and talking about the same thing. How do we as humans, who are particular kinds of people with particular experiences, how do we move in the world in such a way that we can actually make connections with other people who are different from us, and do it with fulfillment and with joy and with purpose? And that's kind of what I think Black feminism is all about.
Well, I definitely know that I am indebted to you for the bridges that you made, not only in my life personally, but also in the incredible, astounding work that you have done over the decades. I want to share with our guests that there is a Patreon page called Barbara Caring Circle, which is a place that you can support her opportunity to not work so hard as we, go through the senior years. I will be putting that in the notes that will follow this when it does get published. Usually it is shared for 1 week on my Patreon page because, and I want to say thank you to my patrons for making it possible for me to have this series, Friends Along the Way. And then after 1 week, it will be made public on YouTube. It is late in the context of the US, and so I am going to give my gratitude, particularly to Barbara, for entering in my life. I think maybe in ways that she didn't think about until, literally when I was contacted by the biographer, I had to think, how would I say to someone who is Barbara Smith in my life? And literally, I never saw a world until she opened up the doorway to it. And I'm so grateful for that opportunity, as I am grateful for you to show up for me today. And thank you all, the rest of you also, for coming.
And I have to say, I have to interrupt, I am grateful to you. What I saw in the summer of 1967 was a 14-year-old young Black woman who was just lit a light, filled with light, the light of brilliance and creativity. It was just like, wow, this person has to have that better chance. And look at where you are now. Look, the world knows who you are. And you like flying in the face of things, clearly, Lady Imam. So we both like pushing envelopes. We really do. Clearly, we like pushing envelopes. So I can't say it's so gratifying to me for you to say the kinds of things that you do, because that's really why we continue to try to help, each other and ourselves to fulfill destinies and dreams.
Thank you. I definitely tell people that, this is the most important person of all the persons that I have had on my program. So I'm endlessly grateful for you.
No.